It'll ask you if that's okay for the panelists. Make sure you hit yes, or when you go to talk, you will not be able to, which you may not want to, but you're going to have to anyway. So, everyone, welcome to all the attendees that we have. For those of you that are here, that are joining in live, welcome. And for anyone that has to duck out or anything like that, we are going to send out a recording after the fact. Question wise, if you have questions, you can type them in. If you look at on Zoom there's a chat, there's a Q&A. Feel free to toss in any of your questions that you may have. And if we have time at the end, we will get to them. If we don't have time at the end, I will send them to the group and have them respond in writing or whatever we need to do. And I will send them out to you. I am going to speak for the club that is here right now, for the group that is here right now, and say that I know from personal experience, their desire is to provide as much transparency as possible into what goes on into the methodology behind these numbers. I'm going to say that for a good portion of them, they were maybe a little hesitant to jump in because I think that they tend to get an unfair treatment to a certain extent. And I'll have folks that may argue with me, and that's fine. We can talk about it later on. But I think that there is a lot that can go into understanding the methodology behind the numbers that the USDA produces, learning where they start, what goes into what results in adjustments, and really kind of understanding the ways that you can use it or use the numbers that they put out to have a better feel for what the market's going to do. And so I guess without further ado, let's rock and roll. You guys, let's start with intros. And I'll let you pick. I'm gonna say ladies first, but I'll let you pick. We'll just put that pressure on you. And tell us a little bit about yourself. Like, what is your background? Where, how did you get into the USDA? And what is your role in the department that you're in? So I'll just free for all, but Joanna, if you want to go first.
Yeah, sure. So my name is Joanna Hitchner. I'm the chair of the Oilseeds Committee at the World Board, where we cover major oilseeds like soybeans, canola, sunflower seed, cottonseed, peanuts, and other minor oilseeds, as well as vegetable oils like palm oil. I've been at the World Board for about 8 years. And prior to that, I worked at the Foreign Agricultural Service on poultry trade, inspired by my grandfather, who was an avian pathologist. And several years before that, I was in the Peace Corps in Panama, working with the Women's Agricultural Cooperative. We planted mangoes and rice and cassava and had different agricultural projects. So I have my BA in economics, and I went to the University of Maryland for my MBA. That's it.
Excellent. Who wants to go next? Mark?
Can you hear
Whichever
me?
One, 50-50.
Yeah.
One of the Marks. We'll go with
Can you hear
Simone
me?
first. Yes, I can.
Okay, we're off to a good start. I'm Mark Simone. I'm the Food Grains Chair for the World Agricultural Outlook Board, where I'm in charge of the Wheat and Rice Interagency Commodity Estimates Committee. I've been in the federal government for most of my career, largely at USDA, where I've had several roles. I was out of the federal government mid-career at a small private analytical firm where I did fundamental market analysis for grains and oilseeds. So I was on the other side of the fence. Grew up in Northern California, and I'm a graduate of University of California, Davis and Oregon State University. Thank you.
Thank you. Michael, do you want to go next? I'm just kind of, or Mark, the other Mark can go next too. I'm seeing you guys in like Brady Bunch style, so I'm just kind of choosing whichever one.
Mark can go. All right, I'll go real quick. So my name is Mark Jekanowski. I'm the chairman of the World Agricultural Outlook Board. I've been in this role since April of 2020. Prior to that, I was deputy chairman for a couple of years. Had various other jobs here at USDA. I was with the Economic Research Service, deputy director for Outlook at ERS, and also the chief of the crops branch at ERS. Also spent about 11 years in the private sector, working with a company Initially called Sparks Companies, an old consulting company in the ag space, and then later at Form Economics. And I have a master's and PhD degree from Purdue University. Did my undergraduate at University of Massachusetts at Amherst, and grew up in Massachusetts on a family-owned vegetable and tobacco farm. It's still in operation. So it was kind of that kind of upbringing on the farm is what attracted me into this field many, many years ago.
Like it a lot. Michael?
Okay, I'm Mike Jewison. I am the coarse grains chair, which encompasses all of the feed grains plus rye. I've been at USDA since 2006 in various roles. I started at the Foreign Agricultural Service in China at their office in Beijing, and I spent some time after that in Washington, and then worked at ERS in Washington working on China and the ICEC process, and I've been at the World Board since 2012 and the feed grains chair since 2016. Background is I'm from Minnesota originally. Got some family that still farms in Waseca and Olmsted counties in southern Minnesota, if you know where those are. And did undergraduate at a school called St. Olaf College in Northfield, Minnesota, if you know where that is, and graduate studies at Georgetown University.
That's funny. One of these days I'll have to pick your. I actually had a girl that I graduated with from high school that went to St. Olaf, probably maybe around the same time. So we'll have to talk afterwards. Lance, last but not least, I was gonna make a different joke, but last but not least, Lance, I'm happy to have you here, Lance, and I love giving you crap, so it's always gonna be a good time. But fill us in. Tell us who you are and a little bit about you for anyone that doesn't know who Lance Honig is.
Yeah, so I'm Lance Honig, or if you're on X, I'm LH, I guess, right? So I learned this week that, well, I won't say that. That was
tell me later.
an oops moment. Sometimes when you're too transparent, you're too transparent. Anyway, so I'm the outlier in this group here, right? Because I'm not part of the World Ag Outlook Board. Angie was kind enough to invite me along because I work alongside my partners here from the World Ag Outlook Board. And so there's a lot of overlap between us and then a lot of separation between us. And so I think having us here together is a good thing. I've been with NASS for 33 years. And so I've done a lot of different things across the agency. I've worked in Kansas, Indiana, North Dakota, a couple of tours here in Washington, DC. And so as of late last fall, I am the chair of the Agricultural Statistics Board, also the director of our methodology division here at NASS. Prior to that, I spent about 15 years as the chief of the crops branch at NASS. And so I've spent a lot of time specifically around the topics that I think we're going to be talking about today. And of course, at NASS, we're the domestic side of things in particular, which is what you hear about today. I grew up on a, modest-sized crop and livestock farm in Northeast Kansas. I have a bachelor's degree in mathematics, of all things, from Kansas State University. And so, yeah, I just very passionate about agriculture and the data around it. I think what we do, the information we have is very important, but I think equally important is understanding that information, where it comes from, how it comes together. And so I love opportunities like this to help answer questions, to help make that even better.
That's what we're here for, right? Like, I feel like there's a lot of time where we don't even, like, for instance, talking about transparency, I reached out to you this morning via email. Lance probably just dreads it, but once every few weeks, maybe every other month or two, I will bug him with something, I feel like. And that's the part that I struggle with sitting here with my analyst hat on or working with farmers or whatever, is I hear or see a lot of conversations about USDA numbers that just really carry with them a lot of misinformation or perhaps something that is old. Folks are like, oh, well, yeah, we never incorporate the FSA data in August, or why would they make that change now? We complain about the lack of whatever, and then we complain about the changes. So that's part of why I want to have this conversation today, is really kind of establish what are the two groups that we're working with here and what do they do. And I feel like what that will do for the attendees and the folks watching will help to really kind of make it a bit more clear how you can incorporate the USDA numbers. They're not the end all and be all. You know, they're a forecast that can be adjusted throughout. And I think as we work through the conversation today, we'll hopefully make that a bit more clear. So Lance, you kind of brought up, and this is just a free for all. You guys can just answer as you see fit. Talk amongst each other, talk over each other, whatever it takes to answer the stuff that I'm asking. But let's talk about the two departments, because Lance had mentioned that you kind of work a little bit parallel, or maybe you contribute to one another, or obviously we see an interwoven sort of line of communication to a certain extent. But fill us in a bit about, what is the World Outlook Board? What is NAS? Like, where do the differences lie? And, where do your roles come into play when it comes to kind of the data release that we get from the USDA?
Sure, and I'll start from a NAS perspective because we're a little bit more focused, right? We focus just on the U.S., and so if you think about USDA, we often refer to NAS as the statistical arm of USDA because that's kind of what we do each and every day. But we only focus on the U.S., and so if you want to think about things like crop forecasting, acreage yield production here in the United States, that is our space at NAS, right? But my friends over at the World Ag Outlook Board, they have to worry about a lot more than just the U.S. And so we're able to, help them at times by allowing them to just adopt the work that we do for the U.S. But they've got to cover a lot more ground than we do. And so, Mark, I'll let you talk about how you utilize what we do and how sometimes we don't have anything for you.
So yeah, I mean, it's interesting that you wanted to go first because you thought of your agency as being focused, but actually I think of us as being pretty focused here too at the World Board, because we are essentially known for one thing, and that is putting out the WASDE report, World Agricultural Supply and Demand Estimates. And so when you think of the concept of the WASDE, what the WASDE is essentially is a document to help to make sense of all of the different types of data that USDA puts out and other government agencies put out that help to inform markets about the supply and demand for these commodities. So, unlike NAS, we're not going out with surveys, collecting information from farmers, but we are users of data, users of information from across USDA. We coordinate input from several different USDA agencies through a monthly, we call it the ICEC process, Interagency Commodity Information Committee. And we put that together monthly to put out the WASDE to just help the public get a better understanding and general context of how tight markets are, or what the overall outlook is for where we expect prices and production to be, both in the U.S. and worldwide. And within that context too, the World Board itself, it's a relatively small agency. Actually, within USDA, I'd call it a very small agency. We have 22 people on staff, including the three chairs here with us today, and then we also have a cotton chair and a livestock chair and a sugar chair. We have some assistants that work with these chairs, 5 meteorologists, and essentially what we're doing is, again, coordinating this information gathering across USDA, pulling it all together to try to make sense of it and report it into WASDE. So that's, again, that's why the World Board and NAS are fundamentally different, in the sense that NAS is a statistical data collection agency. We are really a data user and a data analysis type of an agency that's pulling it all together, domestic and globally.
Like almost like a
data markets.
Aggregate, is that an aggregator, right? Or like a person that puts it in and kind of helps to make it palatable to a certain extent, right? Like if you were to try to take into consideration all of the things you read, how would you even be able to make it make sense, and you kind of take all of the meat and put it onto the bones to a certain extent.
That's
Correct?
the beauty of the balance sheet. Yeah, I mean, the balance
Yes.
sheet sort of summarizes it all into one nice kind of concise unit document, and you can kind of
I
get
like
all of it in just a snapshot.
and we'll dig into the balance sheet a bit more, but I think that that's something that is super important for everyone that's watching, maybe to kind of put into their back pocket, right? Is you guys are putting together the data each month and providing an outlook based on the data that you've been collecting over the last month. It is somewhat forward thinking, but it is not necessarily a forecast of every, like you're betting on normal or what you have. And we'll get further into it. I don't want to get ahead of myself. I'll have the cart in front of the horse here before much longer. But that's interesting. I like that the breakdown of it, where the outlook board is the person that puts together all of the information and provides it to the data user, and NAS is a data collector. Would you say that that fits then for most? Okay, awesome.
And
it's my party. Yeah, Joanna.
one more thing to add is that while the World Board is small, our committees span, USDA on our committees. Prior to the WISE report's release, we have meetings on global production, on global trade, and in US balance sheet meetings. And our committees consist of people from ERS, from FAS, FSA, AMS, and we all get together for these meetings, and kind of we head the committees, and we're kind of the one voice to put out the forecast for USDA.
But you're not alone in what you're doing. Basically, you're just not sitting there making things up.
Right.
It's
a committee process. Yep.
Yeah. Excellent. So when talking about NAS and the Outlook board, do you guys communicate then? I mean, I'm guessing yes, you do. Like in what ways? Is it just, I think we've talked about this before though. Is it just Lance kind of provides you a little black box full of info, or do you guys kind of also interact throughout? And Joanna, you kind of touched on that with the committees kind of coming together and all of that noise. I'm guessing within the USDA, like you said, then, is there a decent line of communication interdepartment wise, would you say?
I'll take a stab at this. Personally, my interaction with NAS is fairly limited. We do see NAS the day of lockup. We get the numbers, and I do interact with the wheat statistician. I do provide him my quarterly stocks estimates when they do their quarterly stocks, and possibly as a check. We do interact with NAS at data users and other meetings, and at the WASD briefing we have after the WASD comes out. So I just, they always like feedback. Sometimes they'll come back to me and say, "Well, what do you think of the numbers?" I said, "Well, yeah, it's right," or there were some concerns, but yeah. Anyway, at the end of the day,
never asked me that. I wish I would get that phone call.
It's just informal. So.
I know.
But yeah, I mean, NAS is not a member of any of the ISA committees, but they do obviously have an important input. So anyway, that's personally. Others may have different interactions.
Yeah, let me just add a little more to some context there. I mean, we need to keep in mind generally that and Lance alluded to this when he was talking about NAS, when it comes to U.S. domestic production, NAS is the source of that information. They collect the surveys, they go out and do the sampling out in the field. I mean, they provide that information and we take it. I mean, there isn't, I mean, we interact with NAS. They're literally right upstairs from us. So we interact socially and collegially, but when it comes to putting the numbers together, NAS, I mean, they have their process. They run that process. We don't second guess it. We don't, we're not the experts in collecting data. So those numbers that NAS provide to us on lockup go directly into the WASD as is, and part of it is to ensure that USDA is speaking with one voice. There is one wheat production number out there, and it's coming from NAS, and it's then reproduced in the WASD. So we're all familiar with each other. We know what each other do. We know what each other does, what our roles are. But NAS is in charge of collecting that domestic information, and that is incorporated directly into the WASD. If that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah,
that
and,
makes
and
sense
from
to
a
me.
NAS perspective, I mean, I would say that we have good communication in general, but when it comes to, I mean, and this is what Mark is alluding to, but when it comes to the data itself, NAS becomes very independent, right? And so I think that's what people hear is that, NAS we don't share our data early with anyone, right? And anyone includes the folks on the screen here until those doors are locked. We don't share any information about the data we've collected. We don't share any information about what we think the numbers we're going to publish are going to be. That's that important issue of, as a statistical agency, we have to maintain that confidentiality, that separation. And so I think a lot of people assume that means we never talk to each other. And that's not true. We just have a line there where we're not going to have a conversation about, well, here's what we think the data is looking like, or here's where we think things are going. But we certainly have ongoing conversations around, what's happening in the industry, or, hey, what are you guys seeing, big picture wise, what's happening. If we have a question about, anything that they do, we can have a conversation. They can ask us the same questions. It's just we have to draw that line when we start having conversations about real life data and things of that.
Makes sense. Yeah. And that's why I wanted to ask the question is I think that sometimes we have this idea that, like I said before, if it's not that you guys are a faceless bureaucracy or a faceless robot of USDA numbers, I think they also think that perhaps there is a level of, I'm going to, for lack of a better term, collusion, so to speak, or, maybe collusion isn't right, but whatever, just as something where you come together and are saying to each other, like, well, this is what it looks like. So make sure that you do this on the backside. And that's not the case. The numbers are released at lockup and they're used, and there's really no way to work around it. So, and I'll have a few more questions on that when it comes to the demand side. And how the board
if
uses.
I might follow up on that, just one quick thing. So we talked about NAS and the World Board, but the interactions with the other USDA agencies are quite different, and that's why when it comes to things, the rest of the balance sheet and especially the foreign balance sheets, our folks interactions with Economic Research Service, FAS, that is a lot more. I mean, that's this ICEC process I refer to. That process is a lot more collaborative, working together. I mean, there's a lot more judgment
collaboration
involved.
Is better than collusion, but that's right, you got the right word.
Exactly. So so people shouldn't think that there's not communication across USDA, because that's not the case. There's a lot of communication across the different agencies of USDA. It's just that NAS is a little bit unique because what they do is so specialized and important to the domestic side, that we don't, again, we take their numbers as given, and there isn't there isn't a need or an opportunity for any kind of second guessing or whatnot. So it's just a different kind of relationship.
I like it. And I think it's good to have that understanding for sure. So let's talk about the process of building a balance sheet. Like, obviously a balance sheet is a gathering of supply and demand figures, but how does it start? How do you, and we can kind of work through however you want to do this on the Outlook board here. Lance, we'll talk about your production numbers in a second, because we obviously get a May report before we have some of that input with acreage, but we don't have yields. Obviously we wait, or we have trend line. We have a different sort of setup when it comes to that. So can we talk a bit about that? Let's talk on the supply side first. Everyone kind of gets their hair up on the whatever, or they get a little angry when we talk about trend line yield, especially as it continues to go up, and we haven't really hit that number here in a minute. You know what I mean? And I'm thinking maybe corn in particular, soybeans, obviously we've seen it, but or even wheat. But where where do you start? Can we talk about the supply side of the balance sheet, a bit about trend line yield and what you guys take into consideration? And then obviously, what factors will influence your demand estimates? And I'm thinking specifically right now, with the May report that comes out, that starting point every year. So have at it. Anyone from the board that wants to start. Say that again. Sorry, Mike.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Start, Mike. Mike, you want to start?
Yeah. On the foreign side, I think it's important to note FAS, for the supply side, FAS is the lead agency in terms of the foreign supply estimates that are in the WASDE. They're the lead agency as far as that goes. That's not to say there are also foreign experts at ERS, but FAS really, that's their wheelhouse. Between their posts overseas and the knowledge that they have from some of the people in their agency, that's really their strength. So starting point in terms of May, obviously trend line yields, that's normal weather. We talk about that a lot. That's a very consistent assumption. And I think, we don't fade yields, for example, based on climate patterns such as El Nino or La Nina. We would not do that. For example, there's a potential for a strong La Nina event and the impact on South America. We would, of course, monitor that and how it impacts the weather developments up to the day of the WASDE, but we would not say, well, this year it's going to be a strong La Nina event, and therefore we would expect a below trend yield outcome for corn in Argentina. If that makes sense. So that's the yield side. The area side is really, for the most part, an economic response to current prices and or other rotational factors. So an easy one for rotational factors is if you've got expanding soybean area in Brazil in the center west, we make assumptions, for example, that we would expect to see expansion in safrinha acres, all else equal, right? So obviously, when we start in May and we go a long way until the next South American crop cycle, right? But that's part of the challenge of the exercise, and of course, updating as we get new information throughout the forecasting cycle. I think that's one thing that people forget about is it's always a snapshot in time every given month. Obviously, if you're in the trade, it's every day, it's every hour, every minute, but for us, it's once a month. So, and so there's that temporal component to it as well, right? Where we are at in the crop cycle. And I think, Joanna, you probably had some stuff to add to that on the supply side.
Yeah, so Mike talked a little bit about the supply side, area being model driven, price reactive, and then yield being a trend. And that can be different for each country depending on the years of data available for that country. And then, so you have beginning stocks plus production plus imports on the supply side. And then for soybeans, for example, it depends on the commodity. Then you have the use side. And for soybeans, like exports, crush, seed and residual, and ending stocks. And those two have to equal each other for each country and commodity. And we strive to not have a negative sign in our balance sheet. So if we don't have enough supply, we can't have a negative ending stocks to push up for the use. So we try to make them equal from when we push them out in May. And so we talked about the supply side a little bit. On the demand side, for oil seeds in particular, for different countries, we look at protein meal and vegetable oil consumption growth. And that can depend on animal growth, GDP growth, population, per capita consumption. And then once we have targets for protein meal consumption growth and vegetable oil growth, we have to divvy it out between the different oil seeds and the oils for each country, whether that's soybeans, canola, sunseed. It depends on whether that country produces it. Sometimes they consume more of it. So once we have more thoughts on that demand side, what a country is going to demand for that year, we talk about how they're going to get it. Is it domestically produced, or is it available? Are there available supplies in exporters that traditionally export those products to the country? So in May, it's kind of like a puzzle piece that we have to put together. And then we have to put the trade side of it together. And you'll typically, once you start the puzzle piece, you'll have more supply than demand, or more demand than supply. And that's why our committees to get together, our team from ERS, FAS, we come together and we try to build this puzzle saying what countries, if there's more demand to supply or supply to demand, like what countries are more price sensitive, who is building out crush capacity, and if there's an oversupply situation, who is the stockholder? Is it the exporting country? Is it an importing country? And so that's some of the building blocks that go into the balance sheet and into one balance sheet and there are a lot of balance sheets that are very interactive and it can get very complex, particularly on the veg oil side and on the meal side.
I like it. I always feel like it's just something to kind of make it more clear, where it's like, it is a puzzle. Like, we are putting all of these pieces together and working to fit them together. And sometimes, you might think that this fits. And then, as Michael said, as time progresses, you're like, wait a minute, but more information shows us that it's not, or that this is different. Obviously the May number is based off from trend line when talking about domestic supply and demand and the balance sheet there. Lance, can we talk a bit about the NASS input? Oh, yes, please.
Could I make one other point real quick?
Yeah.
This kind of ties back to NASS. So we talk about WAB's interaction with NASS. And so on a professional level, the NASS guys know I say this publicly any chance I get. They're the gold standard for public ag statistics. This is the way it is. If you deal in any detail in other parts of the world, it's just the standard. It drops off pretty precipitously. And so from a balance sheet construct, NASS is really good because at the end of the marketing year, they take a look at administrative data and also how that fits together with the supply assumptions, the production assumptions. You don't really see that happen very often in other major ag producers. And if they do it, it's kind of done in a haphazard way, not in a transparent manner. The easy one is China adding a year's worth of corn production over 10 years based on ag census, right? Okay, right? My joke is I told the NASS guys taught him how to do that, right, Lance? Isn't that my joke? NASS used to do a lot of cooperation. They used to do a lot of cooperation in China with helping them get their ag census stood up. And so it's not like they don't know how the methods work. They certainly do, but one could get into debates about other animus that's at work there. So I think the key is that in the U.S., there's an effort that's made after the marketing year is over to reconcile everything in light of, for example, Lance, feel free to correct me if you think I'm wrong, but outside of the bound of what your surveys say, right? You just don't see that in a lot of other major producing countries. Another one that I could pick on pretty easily is Ukraine would be another easy example. And this would predate the conflict, right? This is not, this is kind of a thing that was manifesting somewhat before the conflict. So it's not really related to the conflict. So part of our challenge at the World Board is we go through, we have initial forecasts. They're going to be wrong, right? Pedantically, it's wrong, right? Yeah. It'll be updated as we go through the year. We may not get there right away, but we do endeavor to do the best job that we can. And there's no bias in what we do, right? But that also means when the marketing year is complete and we're reconciling the balance sheet, that sometimes we have to alter our assumptions on the supply side. And so
we make changes.
That's right. And so that's tying back to what I think makes the U.S. so robust vis-a-vis other countries. If only you could have that in other parts of the world. And I keep joking that I think that'll happen, but I'm not holding my breath. So
right. I think that's a super important thing to point out, because I think sometimes we throw stones at NASS for making backwards adjustments, when in reality they're doing it to help improve forecasts down the road. If you continue to just cover up bad data, obviously then something's going to become stinky very soon. It may not be right away. Like when China, I still have emotional scars from that Chinese deal, because I was pushing in 15 and 16. I was like, they're going to have to import corn. There's no way around it. They don't have enough corn. And then they were just like, oops, we just found 16 billion or something like that at one point. Like, it's just chilling over here. And then it turned out that they didn't exist anyway. So they didn't need to import corn. I was just 5 years early. So I wasn't wrong. I was just way, 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 way too early. So, but no, I think that's a very important point that we are, and that's one thing too, as we kind of build on to this today. You know, one thing that I've discovered, the more I've communicated with folks like Seth, with folks like Lance, with you guys at the Outlook board, is that, you know, Lance said that I'm passionate about data, like as, you know, but each and every one of you that I've encountered are passionate about making sure that you're putting out good data. And that does mean that sometimes you have to get out the eraser and say, hey, we thought based on these things that this is what was going on, but it turns out now that we're at the end and we have to add these together, this is what actually took place. And if you think about it, when you're talking about hundreds of billions of bushels around the world, or even just 15 billion bushels of corn in the US, like to be able to get within 10% of that in October is pretty phenomenal in my opinion. And I'm not here to be a USDA stan, you know, like I'm not, I like to share the questions and the answers and the transparency because I think it's important. But I also think it's great to understand, you know, how much effort goes into making sure that the data is right, even if it's months later. So Lance, let's talk about that because I want to talk about the process that goes into some of the production estimates. Obviously, you know, where you start and how you refine the figures throughout the year is something that I feel like a lot of folks tend to get a bit of confusion about. You know, and obviously, or maybe not obviously, but this month I think is going to be one of the months where, depending on what your data says as you collect it, because obviously we have no idea. You're still 2 weeks out from, I mean, I will talk about the process of the August numbers, but August was the first month that you're going to incorporate FSA and yield data and all of that jazz. So can we talk a bit about, you know, the process of putting together your production numbers from the surveys in March and June, and then how you kind of work to refine that data as the year progresses?
Yeah, sure. And so acreage and yield can almost need to be two different conversations to some extent, right?
Yeah.
There's a lot of overlap between the two, but we'll separate just for simplicity's sake. And so from an acreage standpoint, March and June, you know, for most crops, corn, soybeans, we'll just kind of focus there. It's all survey based. That's all there is, right? If you think about from a big picture standpoint, we've got data we gather from the survey work we do. There's administrative data available, again, eventually, from places like the Farm Service Agency, the Risk Management Agency in particular. And then there's the geospatial component, right? We can use satellites to get a pretty darn good measure of planted area across the country, but neither FSA, RMA, nor satellites can tell you anything about acreage in March. You know, probably largely because there's nothing planted, and certainly not emerged. And so it's 100% survey based and it's pre-planting. And so it is survey based on what farmers say they expect or intend to do. And so much like Mike said, when they talk about some of their early forecasts, March is going to be wrong, right? And so it's in some respects, it's one of our least favorite things to do at NASS, right? Because it's like, we're almost guaranteed to be wrong because A, it's super early, but more important than that, it's one of the tools that farmers will now use to determine what they actually plant. And so now they find out what everybody else is thinking. And so that's going to alter their plan. So it's almost by design going to be wrong. And so we follow that back up in June with another survey because, again, nobody's certified their acres with FSA yet because you're talking about the very beginning of June. There's no crop insurance data available yet. And satellites still can't tell you anything because even if it's planted, it's not emerged to the point where you've got enough spectral signal across the board to get a measure. So it's going to be survey based. That's just how it has to be. And from a yield perspective, we kind of run into that same challenge where we kick off for corn and soybeans our yield forecasting in August. So that's, you know, right. In fact, we just started data collection on that. What's today? The 30th today. And so for the next week or so, we're going to be, you know, bugging a lot of farmers about, hey, what do you expect your yields to be? And so that's, again, there's a couple of, you know, sources of data there. You can do it with survey-based reports. You can do it from going into fields, which we'll start doing next month. And you can do it with satellite. information. And so we look at all three of those components, but we zero in on what history tells us has been the best predictor over time. And at this point in time, it still says that in August, this early in the season, what farmers tell us is the most accurate predictor. Satellites, it's getting better, right? We're getting better information there than we used to, but it still can't compete with the data that we get from the producers at this point in the season. That's just how it is. We stopped going into the fields in this first survey period back in 2019, I think. And a lot of people I know think that, oh my gosh, the August numbers are no good because you're not going into the fields. And I am telling you that we have years and years of history that told us we didn't need to go into those fields in August, because based on maturity levels and based on the reporting that we were seeing over many, many years of history, we could predict yield just as well by only focusing in on what the farmers tell us, as opposed to also incorporating that field data. And so we want to be efficient with the resources that you all are providing to us as a government agency. And so that's why we focus in on just farmer responses in August. Now, back to the acreage piece for August. Now we can start to look at things like the FSA certified acreage information. Wasn't available to us in time for the acreage report. And over time, it's gotten available earlier and earlier. And so this will be the first year that for all of these crops, we're going to look at that in August, because FSA has done a better job of getting that data, processed through their systems faster. We've seen for a few years, looking at the data, that we can make good decisions based on that information earlier. And so we're going to, because the sooner we can get more accurate numbers out there, whether it's acreage or yield, the more accurate numbers you're going to have to work with. And so we are going to be incorporating that FSA acreage data this month into the report for all the crops. It's not a rumor. I've had a few emails over the last week or so that, people have heard rumors, but it's my fault. True, right? No, it is true. And so we'll actually be putting a notice out, hopefully tomorrow, if not Thursday, just to dispel all of those rumors and make it clear.
Correct me if I'm wrong. I thought Nick Streff at the last stream crop production report also mentioned it publicly too, did he not? If I remember correctly?
It's been made public. I mean, we talked about it in data users as well, but if you weren't here or weren't there, then you may have only heard it second or third hand. And so that's why we want to make sure we get a notice out there that says, okay, everybody, hello, this is what we're doing, part of the transparency piece. And so when I start getting a lot of emails and questions wondering about things, that's when you a lot of times see us do a notice or something, because that's the tip off that, hey, maybe things aren't clear. And so what can we do?
People are talking about it, but
yeah. And so the important thing, just one last thing I'll mention, since we've been talking about the difference between the World Board and NASS, this forecast that's coming out on August 12th really speaks to the importance of understanding that difference, right? Because in the WASDE, there has been a U.S. corn number since May, right? But as I mentioned, August 12th will be the first NASS issued corn forecast for yield. And so the methodology is different. And so I think it's important for folks to realize that that's where you need to understand the difference between the World Board and NASS, because the methodology is going to be different with that number. And so if it's different, if the corn yield changes, so to speak, in August, that does not necessarily mean, whatever that difference is, that the crop got that much better or worse. You have to remember, part of the difference is there is a methodology shift. It goes from being a trend-based type forecast to one that is literally based on data collected from producers here in the U.S., with also some look at satellite imagery across the U.S. as to what's growing. And that's what's going to be driving that yield forecast for the rest of the season compared to what drove that forecast early in the season. Not saying it's better or worse, it's just different.
Different.
That's what you need to understand about the difference between the World Board and NAS when it comes to the US component of that balance sheet.
I feel like that's that's part of why I wanted to have you jump in with this, is because I think so many times people say, oh, the USDA, not realizing that the USDA's, like we talked about before, is made up of so many different agencies that are considered experts in their own particular field, whatever that may be, whether it's data collection, the Economic Research Service obviously is going to look at different things than what Foreign Agricultural Service may be looking at to a certain extent, but all of it is the same in the end, or all of you are working towards a similar goal, which is providing insight and kind of helping make things clearer or more clear. So for the Outlook Board, then, obviously, like aside from the obvious, like with the changes in production, like how do changes in production figures influence your balance sheets? Like, is there ever a time where a sharp, I'm going to say surprise, obviously, like every number is a surprise when you get it, because it's not something that you've discussed ahead of time. And based on the conversation, you've kind of got an idea built around, demand to a certain extent. I'm going to guess, or I'm guessing, I'm assuming. So I want you guys to clarify a little bit, like when it comes to the NAS production numbers, if there is a big shock or if there is a big adjustment, how does that impact what you do? Have you ever had it to where something has been, quite shocking and you've had to make some major changes potentially because of the information that NAS has provided? Whoever wants to go first can go first.
I'll take a stab at it.
Okay.
So we received NAS's numbers in lockup, but the day that the WASDE and NAS production reports are released. But before that, we have meetings with our committees about, like I said, global production, global trade, and the U.S. balance sheet. And in those meetings, we come up with scenarios of what NAS could provide in, for example, the August lockup. And we have a range of scenarios that when we receive the U.S. number, yes, it impacts the U.S. balance sheet, but it also, we have to go back. We receive the paper from NAS, and then we go to our committees, and we have a discussion with our committees based on the scenarios that we had already talked about prior to entering into lockup. And so if they provide us a bigger number, what does that mean for global trade? What does that mean for Brazil and China? And we have these discussions with our committees in lockup, but have the scenarios beforehand. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yes. I was looking at the questions too as I was listening. I'm multitasking.
You're squinting
I didn't
at
want
me.
you to think I was just like not enjoying. Like, yeah, thanks, Joanna. Like, I'm not even checking my Twitter feed. No.
I'll make the point. I think it was made already, but while we don't publish forecasts of bilateral trade in the WASDE, certainly when we put the world together, there's some thought behind the curtain as far as that goes. Trade for the U.S. is not an exogenous number that, anybody can pick out of the sky. 2.1 billion bushels for corn, for example, right? Well, how'd you come up with that? What does the rest of your globe say? What's your export flows out of Brazil, Argentina, and Ukraine, for example? What are your import flows, right? What's your Mexican import number? What's your China import number, right? There's a lot of specific assumptions that we have to go through every single month, whether it be corn, whether it be on the oilseed side, or even on the wheat side too as well. So trade for us is not it's not an exogenous line item that just shifts because, supply chains. It's, what's going on in the rest of the world and how do we need to alter our thinking based on this kind of production change in the U.S. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense.
We have to balance the world every month.
Yeah.
So that's what we have to come up with.
Like reconciling a checkbook, but just with tons of bushels everywhere, and you're not sure who that check was written to, but you're going to figure it out eventually, kind of do. Like that's to a certain extent. So when you balance, that makes sense. And so you'll take the scenario basically, or you'll have a range of where it could land. And then obviously there is an impact based on production and world events and all of those other things that you're going to have to factor in. And you get to do that all within an hour, basically, half hour, maybe. How long would you say that Lance hands you the paper? Like,
You've thought about it though, right? This isn't.
Yeah.
So when you think about it, this is like, think of it as a mental exercise. How does the world change? How does the world, given these supply changes, what is the implication for price and what is the implication for the rest of the world, right? So there's a lot of thought that goes into that process. Actually, from a balance sheet nerd perspective, it's actually a useful exercise. Because if you get really extreme with price moves, it really challenges folks on the committee to really think outside of what the prevailing market narrative is, right? So, if you follow me on that, so
yeah, no, I totally, it makes sense. You come into it with an idea. You've already been putting the thoughts on paper, basically, and you're just kind of like, all right, if X is this, then Y, so to speak. Like that's kind of, and then you get to do it around the world.
NASA's a no, right? But for us in our world, we got to say, well, what if? And then you could say, well, that's a low probability event, but nevertheless, that's still an exercise that we go through in terms of the preparation.
Most of the time, whenever I assess a low probability event from NAS, that's the one they go to. I'm like, they could surprise us with acres much higher than expected, but I doubt it. And Lance has my phone bugged, and he's like, oh, okay, that's fun. I'm just kidding, obviously.
But again, circling back to, I want to reiterate Lance's previous point, which is that it's a survey-based number, right?
Yeah.
In my professional opinion, there's no substitute for someone using weather models, or yes, those are good tools to use, and you should use them. However, the survey data, as Lance said, really drives it, and it really should be more robust than any of the more, for lack of a better term, blunt instruments that sometimes some people use, right? So
yeah, that makes perfect sense to me. So we talked a bit about the foreign production estimates, right, and all of the factors that come into play when you put those estimates together. Let's talk a little bit about the spread between your numbers and the foreign entities that are out there, because obviously, you guys have some numbers, and one of the biggest ones, is the Brazil, the USDA versus Brazil. And so obviously we have CONAB numbers and we have USDA numbers, and there's a pretty wide spread, and everyone's been waiting for them to reconcile, but there really hasn't been a reason necessarily to see that reconciliation, I guess you could say. But what are your thoughts on those spreads? Like, what says you guys, responsible for these numbers that are obviously quite a bit? I would say quite a bit, but in some cases they are. Every 8 million metric ton or so is a quarter of a billion bushels. It's not a small amount, especially when taking into consideration, our export figures that we're looking at. What are your thoughts on the spread between you and your foreign counterparts? And, has there been discussions amongst each other, you and members of CONAB potentially, or, these other foreign entities, about a reconciliation potentially?
I will kick this question on.
I figure you and I have actually we talked about it a little bit in February about the USDA, when you bumped up, but anyway, yeah, I want you to fill us in.
So before I begin to answer the difference between Brazil and the US, I'd like to highlight that the majority of our historical production estimates, at least on the oilseed side in particular, come from in-country sources, whether that be the government of Argentina, Ministry of Agriculture for soybeans, or oilseed processing associations like SOPA for India. But there are times when our estimates deviate from the in-country sources, and two examples are Brazil soybeans and Ukrainian sunflower seed. And the reason we've had to deviate is because after the marketing year is complete, there was too much use, too much exports, too much crush than the supply could accommodate, and we couldn't make ends meet. It's like you can't eat more cookies than are in the box. There had to have been more cookies in the box. So in the case of Brazil soybeans, our historical production estimates, we have several years of production estimates that are higher than in-country sources, and our current forecast is higher than the government's currently. And so our estimates are reconciled with the use data after the season is complete. So at the end of 2024, this year, they will use up their crop, and we will reconcile their crop based off of ABOV crush data, which is similar to NOPA in the United States, and official export data. And we do this every single year. And this is similar to the process that NAS does in the United States, where they'll revisit last year's crop this September. So when we're reconciling the crop, we have to make sure that the crop size is big enough for the use that's happening. And so we have several years of higher estimates than cannot be built off of higher yields and higher area in some years. So when we were evaluating the yield this year, after drought impacted several states, and then we had that late season flooding in Rio Grande do Sul, we had a higher yield series and higher area that we were jumping off of. And so during the season, our year over year decline percentage wise was actually very similar to Cannabis. It was just off of a higher base. And I think one of the unfortunate things this year and what caused a lot of confusion, I believe, is that we missed the 2023 crop by so much at the same time that the 2024 crop was in drought. So at the end of last year, when we were reconciling the crop, Brazil kept exporting, they kept crushing. And we raised that crop by several million tons, 6 million tons to plus 160 million tons, which clearly had implications on the area and yield and the potential that Brazil had for the next year's crop. And if you remember, the 2023 crop wasn't, I mean, it was a great crop in certain parts of the country, but Rio Grande do Sul was facing the same drought-like conditions that Argentina was facing. So it wasn't like a perfect crop, yet they were able to do plus 160 million tons based off of the use data. And like I said before, we have to balance supply and demand. So if we had lower production estimates throughout several years, we'd end up having negative ending stocks. But in this case, so we have to raise production to not have negative residual or negative ending stocks in our balance sheets because they have to balance. So this was all happening at the same time. You know, Brazil's in drought in 2024 while we're raising the 2023 crop. And had we known the potential of that 2023 crop, we wouldn't have started the 2024 crop at 163 million tons. So our drop from 163 million tons down to 153, it doesn't seem like a big drop, but it would have been off of a higher number had we known that the yield in area could have been larger in the prior year. So did we talk to our counterparts? Yes, our post has been in contact with Cannabis this year, and in times when we've had production estimates deviate, this isn't the first time that this has happened. We flew down there in 2006 to have a conversation, and we also talked to them in 2019 and around 2019, 2020. We're very open to conversations with any foreign counterpart about the way we estimate crops or our differences. So if you want to call us, please do. Our number is in the WASDE report.
Yeah, you're wide open.
Wide open.
Feedback on the corn side too, because we have had a pretty decent spread on corn, you know, between US and Brazil, especially this year, like currently. You know, is it a similar sort of scenario where we're struggling to kind of pin down potentially where the starting point is, or what are you seeing there?
I think it's it's similar to soybeans, but of course on corn, as you know, the utilization data, the administrative data, to use a NAS term, is not as complete, right? Although we've had a recent uptick in the amount of corn that's going into ethanol, so that's another component of use that we have a better handle on that we didn't have before, in addition to exports. So we're still evaluating that, and that remains to be seen how that will turn out. But it should be one of those things like with soybeans that it will reconcile in time eventually, as we get more data for the marketing year.
I like it. It makes sense. All right, we're down to our last 3 minutes. Like, time flies when you're having this much fun. I just looked there, I was like, holy cow. So we're gonna jump across a couple because we've touched on quite a few things. You know, what impacts your balance sheet, and we've got 7 questions that I will send out to the group after the fact and let you guys just kind of answer. And then when I send the recording out, I will send it out just for anyone that wasn't listening in the introduction or jumped in late. But let's just go to the last question. And I think this one's important, you know, especially because, like we talked about before, I want to put a face and a name to the folks that are putting together these numbers and really help to try to bring some clarity to the conversation, you know, about what goes into it. You're not just pulling arbitrary numbers out of thin air. You know, you guys are doing a lot of work and working with a lot of different groups to really try to put together the best, you know, clearest information that you can. So as we work to wrap up today, like, what is the one thing, and we'll just kind of go around the circle in the same pattern that we did on the intros. What is the one thing you wish folks understood about the information that you put out? So Joanna, if you want to start, and then, or Mark, you can go. If Mark's, if
Yeah,
Mark,
Mark, go.
yeah, go ahead.
I'll just start real quick. If I have to, narrow it to one thing, I would say that I really hope that people understand, and I want people to understand, when it comes to the WASD, it is a completely non-political process. It doesn't matter. It isn't going to matter who's president next year. It isn't going to matter whether or not we have a farm bill. The WASD is still going to be put out the same way it's always been put out. The folks that you see on the screen here today are going to be working on it along with, anywhere up to 75 or 100 other people across USDA, all doing their best, using the data they have. And there's no opportunity for any kind of political or other agendas to enter into the process.
I dig it. Michael, you want to go next? You look like you may have had a thought.
I guess I would say, I say this a lot, but we truly are price agnostic, right?
Mm-hmm.
We strive, we endeavor to put out the most reliable, objective data, right? Notice how I didn't say accurate. My former boss, the late Alan Rifkin, used to say it's not always accurate because his point was we don't always get it correct, right? And that's bound to happen in something that's as subjective as what we do. But we're price agnostic. We do our best to get it right, but we may not get it right all of the time. So, but just know that there's not, me conspiring to do something to the corn market with my committee. No, that's not it at all. That is not it at all. It's reliable, objective market information. That's the goal.
Mr. Mark Simone, you want to go? Like I said, I'm just going Brady Bunch style now. I'm just going.
Sure, why not? I'll be Greg.
Yeah, literally, I was going to say, we'll call you Greg. So go ahead.
One of the principal economic indicators as defined by OMB, and that Joe Parsons always said that when he started the briefing session, something I always take very seriously. It can be a very humbling experience, and we're not perfect, but that's why we do this every month. So, yeah, that's what I'd like to say. And feedback, it's part of the job. Mm-hmm. And I always, good or bad, it shows me you care when I get feedback, and that's something always welcome it.
I like it. Joanna?
In a technical sense, I want people to know that we forecast with policy in place and normal weather moving forward. I think that's super important because if you are a forecaster and you think the policy is going to change, or you think a drought is going to persist past the day that the WASD was released, then your estimate is going to be different than ours. And so you can kind of use our estimate as a benchmark and then kind of tweak it to what your assumptions are going to be, but knowing that we use policy that's currently in place and normal weather moving forward. And also our phone lines are open. If people have questions or feedback, we're happy to receive it.
Yeah, and know that I've already promised Joanna, if anyone gives her mean feedback, I will bodyguard for her. So
Thank you.
That's why you don't want this heat, you guys. So just let me know. Lance, what would you like to throw out to the group, and then we'll kind of close her up for the day.
Well, first off, I'm a little worried, or not worried, but a little disappointed that I didn't get the same offer.
That's because I threatened to take you out. If you,
well, it's like the opposite almost. But the one thing, Mark Jekanowski nailed it. I mean, far and away, number one is, I obviously want people to understand that it's not politically motivated. But the corollary to that then, especially from an ask perspective, would be that I would hope people would understand that it is truly data driven as well. So not only is it not political, it's not Lance Honig's opinion either. It's data driven based on the best information that we have at any given time. And that's what contributes to that, fact that there's no motivation from any other thing other than taking the information that we have and providing the best estimates that we can based on that data. And whatever the results may be, they may be. Whatever the implications may be, they may be. Our job is to give you unbiased, accurate information based on whatever we know today.
I appreciate it. Yeah. That's I appreciate it. I think we probably could have made this about another hour longer because I have a ton of other questions on things, and we've obviously got a bunch more. And
And
so, like,
there was a
yeah,
document there's a document I wanted to share that documents this process. It's called Understanding Crop Forecasts. It was
Love
written
it.
by Fred Vogel at NASS and the late Jerry Bangy, who was the longtime World Ag Outlook Board chair. I want to drop it in the chat, or I guess I saw
Yeah.
some people asking about.
Yeah, go ahead.
There
Drop
it
it
is.
in the chat there. And then I will grab the link as well. Let me try to grab it. Or if you could you email that to me, and I'll make sure to send it out to
Sure.
all the registrants too.
Sure.
That'd be awesome. And so I will, in closing, you know, I want to say that I really, really appreciate your guys' time. You know, I know that at first there were probably a lot of thoughts about what on earth is she asking us to do, and why, you know, and Lance and Seth have kind of been victims. I mean, they participated in my webinars in the past. And it has, I cannot express enough to the attendees right now. They're wide open. They're going to share the info with you, and there is zero excuse to gnash your teeth or call the numbers imaginary or any of that. Like, you can talk smack about the USDA all you want. You start to talk about their numbers being imaginary, and it kind of really, because I know the effort that you guys put into it. I know the work that goes into play. I know the agencies that are kind of around it. And I know that every one of you are like, hey, sometimes we do get it wrong, but we're really trying to not get it wrong. And so I think, you know, kind of to leave today, the biggest thing that I want to kind of explain to the audience here is get comfortable with understanding the methodology, know the difference in the groups, you know, that are part of the USDA and that help put together the estimates that we use. Know and be aware of when certain types of data are rolled out, like being aware that the FSA information and that the yield number will be survey based is super important. You know where the May numbers come from, and Michael will share that with us. We'll be able to throw that out there, but there's zero reason to be ignorant about the numbers that the USDA puts out. And I think probably the biggest thing to understand from these monthly numbers is like what we said here today. It's a snapshot in time. It is a forecast that is put together based on the assumption that things continue normally in the months ahead, and that they'll make adjustments accordingly if they don't. If weather gets a little rowdy, if policy changes, if we see increased in blend rates, and you know, things of that nature, that's all going to influence, you know, the balance sheet. And sometimes it may feel like they're behind on the adjustments, but they can't bet on the come either. So anything you guys want to add? We're 7 minutes over, so I apologize, but if you don't, then we'll call it a day. And I appreciate the heck out of your time. Like I said, I will send out, just to reiterate, I will send out all of the questions. I'm going to send the questions over to the group here this afternoon. They'll respond, and I'll send that recording out for you, everyone, in the morning with the info attached. And if you need anything at all, just let us know. Otherwise, have a great day.
Thanks, Angie.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.